Welcome back of 12. We are going to continue our discussion of elections this week, and I hope you had an awesome spring break and you're feeling ready for our own class election. But first, let's talk about money. So, campaign finance specifically, how we regulate money in elections. In 2016, as a country, people spent $6.5 billion on the election. That's not only the presidential election, but congressional races as well. Specifically for the presidential election, we spent $2.6 billion. That's a lot of money. And the federal government would like to track that and regulate it. And we'll kind of talk about the evolution of that. So, of those dollars, where are they going? Most of them are spent on advertisements. And almost every advertisement you'll notice is negative. So, in history, the first negative ad is known as this commercial Daisy. So, let me show you this.
These are the stakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
So the Daisy campaign is still known as one of the most controversial campaign commercials of all time. Johnson was playing on people's fears of nuclear war and nuclear annihilation, but he ended up winning in a landslide against Barry Goldwater. As early as Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, the government was attempting to rein in campaign finance and set regulations. For example, the Tillman Act attempted to stop corporate and banking contributions to elections. However, there was no real government entity to enforce it. It wasn't until the 70s that the real regulation started with the Federal Election Campaign Act, which was passed in 1971, and there's an amendment in 1974. It tracks campaign spending, so where do all of those dollars go? And you have to report money that's raised as a candidate. You have to register with the FEC, the Federal Election Commission that was created by this law. And it also starts to limit campaign spending, and there's going to be a lot of pushback on that. The court case that first looked at these new regulations was Buckley v. Valeo. This was in 1976. And it sets the limits on hard money and it protects soft money. These are terms we still use today. So hard money, an easy way to think about it is that it's hard to raise because it's limited. So individuals like you and I, if we wanted to donate to a campaign, in 1976, we could give $1,000 or less. That was our limit. Political action committees, which are entities that are created solely to raise funds for candidates and ballot measures, their limit was $5,000. But there were certain types of money that could be spent in an unlimited fashion, meaning there was no cap. This is known as soft money, and it's protected by the First Amendment because it said that the ability to advertise and get the word out about a candidate is your freedom of speech. A lot of people think that's kind of a stretch, but that's how the courts have justified it constitutionally. So you can give an unlimited amount of money to a party because parties are not supposed to represent any specific candidate. They're supposed to be a separate entity. You can spend your own money as a candidate. There's no limit on that under Buckley v. Valeo, as well as individual expenditures, meaning an organization that advertises for the candidate but never actually gives them the money. 2 terms you'll hear a lot if you're watching the news during this election cycle for the 2020 election would be political action committees and special interest groups. So political action committees are more commonly known as PACs. They're different than super PACs. We're going to get to that later. I know it's confusing, but they're different. PACs, again, are regulated, and their main job is to raise funds and donate them to campaigns. Whatever their specific interest is, they're going to support the candidate that's most likely to push that agenda. Emily's List is a PAC that focuses on getting women into office, specifically pro-choice women. Special interest groups, they have the goal of getting legislation passed in their favor. The National Rifle Association is one of the most powerful lobbying groups in the country, most powerful special interest groups. And what they do is lobby. That means influencing Congress, men and women, to pass a law that benefits them. They'll also work with litigation, which is action in the courts, and grassroots mobilization, which is the people, their members, getting involved. So interest groups are protected by the First Amendment as well. However, there are some regulations on interest groups, and this will get us to campaign finance again, because if they're going to give money to a campaign, then they have to register that money or record it, disclose it to the FEC. They have to follow campaign finance laws. All lobbyists must be registered with the federal government. They can't give gifts to candidates over a certain amount. Usually they're limited to a lunch or something under $100. They can't bribe them, which is giving someone money, a candidate, and asking them for something in return. And there's not many, but there are some limits on the revolving door, meaning a lot of people who work for congressmen, the young people who aren't much older than you guys, they want jobs as lobbyists because lobbyists make huge salaries. So they can't promise to do things and fix laws in the lobbyist's favor in return for a job. So here's a little bit more information on that.
Lobbyists play a big role in American politics. They get bills passed, politicians elected, and national programs funded. But according to a 2013 Gallup poll, only 6% of Americans view lobbyists as honest or ethical. So how is it that one of our most politically influential groups is also one of the least trustworthy? Let's start by looking at what lobbying actually is. The National Conference of State Legislatures defines lobbying as a citizen's right to speak freely, to impact decisions, and petition the government. And lobbying can be that simple. People or groups petitioning their representatives to vote for issues they care about. But that's not all lobbying is. It's also big business carried out by professionals who register with the government and are paid by third parties to lobby on their behalf. It sounds ominous, but it doesn't necessarily have to be bad. There are hundreds of examples of professionals lobbying for things like AIDS prevention and poverty relief. One group named Results successfully lobbied to increase government funding for child survival by $50 million. But of course, there is another side to lobbying as well. Between 2008 and 2010, a study of 30 different corporations found that they spent $476 million on lobbying, and in return received almost $11 billion in tax rebates. Some would say this is a good example of big business using lobbyists to cheat the system. Critics of lobbying also point to corruption cases like the Jack Abramoff scandal and increased lobbying by corporations after major ecological disasters like the BP oil spill. They see this as evidence that the system is broken and needs reform. So why hasn't the system changed? Well, politicians have tried, but the benefits of lobbying typically outweigh the desire for reform. President Obama, for example, campaigned for reform while running in 2008, and on his first day in office, he even signed an executive order restricting lobbyists from taking certain government positions, which was a good step forward for lobby reform. But then in 2013, he allowed the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, who exist under the executive branch, to give over $500,000 to a registered lobbyist to help promote his Affordable Care Act. The fact of the matter is that lobbying isn't just a political reality for our elected officials, it can also be a financial boon. According to reports, in 2012, half of all retiring congressmen became lobbyists, which makes sense because lobbying is a $3 billion a year industry that former politicians happen to be uniquely qualified for.
The United States is unique compared to other democracies in how we allow unlimited campaign funding. The way that politicians see it is that corporations can use their money to outweigh the will of the people because they can spend a lot more money on advertising than the average Joe can off the street. So Democrats and Republicans, in a bipartisan move in 2002, passed what's known as the McCain-Feingold law that totally bans soft money spending in elections. It raised the hard money limits to allow individuals and PACs to spend a little bit more. And it went as far as to regulate what's called electioneering communications. So advertising for a campaign on TV, the radio, the internet, etc. So 30 days before the primary elections and 60 days before the general elections. You're probably saying to yourself, I've seen commercials, within that time frame because this was, quickly done away with in a matter of years. We'll get to that. It was challenged, but the Supreme Court upheld it in 2002. So pretty soon after McCain-Feingold, groups found ways to advertise anyway and spend money and get around the law. One of the ways was to advertise as a 527, meaning you're not actually advocating for a candidate, you're just publicizing issues. And 501c groups could also get around the limits on soft money spending if they were a religious organization, an educational organization, a charity, or some kind of research group. So the famous advertisement is the Swift boat ad that was targeted at John Kerry, who was running against George Bush. There's a term now called swift boating, which means that it's an unfair, untrue attack against a candidate.
They had personally raped, cut off ears, cut off heads.
The accusations that John Kerry made against the veterans who served in Vietnam was just devastating.
Randomly shot at civilians.
And it hurt me more than any physical wounds I had.
Cut off limbs, blown up bodies.
That was part of the torture, was to sign a statement that you had committed war crimes.
Razed villages in fashion reminiscent of Genghis Khan.
John Kerry gave the enemy for free what I and many of my comrades in North Vietnam in the prison camps took torture to avoid saying. It demoralized us.
Crimes committed on a day-to-day basis.
He betrayed us in the past. How could we be loyal to him now?
Ravaged the countryside of South Vietnam.
He dishonored his country and, more importantly, the people he served with. He just sold them out.
Swift Boat Veterans for Truth is responsible for the content of this advertisement.
So the attack against Kerry in 2004 was meant to make him seem unfit to serve as president because he offered this willful distortion of facts of what happened in the Vietnam War. However, most of the people that served with Kerry agreed that his accounts of the war were true, and the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth were fined, and this advertisement was no longer played. So the challenge to McCain-Feingold starts here with Fahrenheit 9/11. Fahrenheit 9/11 is still to this day the most popular documentary of all time. This is also 2004, so the same year that the Swift boat ad came out. They were not allowed to show that, but Michael Moore was allowed to show this, and it was because he's considered media. I want you to think about it and see if this is mentioning perhaps a candidate and if it sheds perhaps a negative light on a candidate. But this is allowed to be shown because it's advertising for a movie.
You can make people do anything if they're afraid.
The FAA has taken the action to close all of the airports in the United States.
All commercial and airline traffic was grounded.
When we had some airplanes authorized at the highest levels of our government to pick up Osama bin Laden's family members and transport them out of this country.
In the middle of the war, corporations decided to hold a conference to figure out how much money could be made.
Once that oil starts flowing, it's going to be lots of money. Whatever it costs, the government will pay you.
It's going to be good for business, bad for the people.
Congressman, trying to get members of Congress to get their kids to enlist in the Army and go over to Iraq.
The USA Patriot Act allows for searches of medical and financial records.
It gives law enforcement almost unlimited power. They wait till the middle of the night. It's printed in the middle of the night.
How could Congress pass this Patriot Act without even reading it?
Sit down, my son. We don't read most of the bills.
No one read it.
Members of Congress, this is Michael Moore. I would like to read to you the USA Patriot Act.
Let the eagles soar.
From the corridors of power,
Congressman,
to the streets of small-town America, to the front lines.
This is an impressive crowd, the haves and the have-mores. Some people call you the elite. I call you my base.
Comes the true story that will make your temperature rise.
I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive.
So in 2004, what candidate did this movie advertisement attack? Obviously, George Bush. So a group called Citizens United started making films because they decided, okay, if you can show movie advertisements, we'll just make films. So they made one called Hillary the Movie in 2008. They played this to try to defeat her in her race for the primary election. Barack Obama actually ended up winning. But Citizens United was not allowed to show this because they're not media like Michael Moore. They're a political organization. And let me show you this. There are some obvious differences in the tone versus Fahrenheit 9/11. But it was a 90-minute film.
Senator Clinton is claiming basically the entire 8 years of the Clinton presidency as her own, except for the stuff that didn't work out, in which case she says she has nothing to do with it.
She makes herself sound like she has diplomatic experience, like she has managerial experience, as if she has policy development experience. She doesn't have any of those things.
She does not answer questions straight out.
I did not say that it should be done.
You said yes.
No.
You thought it made sense to do it.
No, I didn't, Chris. But the point is, what are we going to do with all these illegal immigrants?
Unless I missed something, Senator Clinton said two different things in the course of about 2 minutes.
She's driven by the power. She's driven to get the power. That is the driving force in her life.
She is
steeped in controversy, steeped in sleaze. That's why they don't want us to look at her record.
Well, I think it's worth remembering, after her healthcare fiasco, the Clinton team put it aside.
I mean, certainly you have to ask whether she's learned a lot from that experience. It was a failure. She knows it was a failure. It was a very embarrassing failure for her.
I'm going to pause it here. But I want you to think about the difference between Fahrenheit 9/11 versus Hillary the movie. I'm going to ask you when we get together in class, what do you see as the major differences? Despite Michael Moore being considered media, why couldn't Citizens United play this commercial? So the case that still stands today is called Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. This was decided in 2010. It's a very controversial decision. It overturned part of McCain-Feingold, and it allowed for soft money once again. It allowed corporations as well as labor unions to fund advertising through what's called an independent expenditure. So the candidate never gets the money. However, they raise hundreds of millions of dollars and make commercials for the candidates through these organizations called super PACs. I'm going to show you a commercial made by a super PAC against Barack Obama in a minute. So here's another negative ad targeted at Barack Obama. This is from 2012.
Crazy of the United Steezy. So in love.
Nice. He's a jackass. He's a jackass.
So today, the contribution limits are $2,600, from an individual to a candidate. So if you wanted to write a check to a candidate this year, you could give them up to $2,600 or go on their website and donate. PACs are still held to $5,000. $10,000 can be given to your state or local party, and then $32,400 to your federal party committee, so the DNC or the RNC.